talk. So today I'm very pleased to have Susan Wyche here and Jennifer Olson presenting. So a little bit of information. So Dr. Wyche is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information at Michigan State University, where she's also affiliated with the university's African Studies Center. Her research primarily focuses on human-computer interaction. She conducts field work in primarily Kenyan sites that she has been visiting since 2007. Dr. Wyche received her PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Tech. She is a 2015 recipient of the NSF Career Award. Dr. Olson is also an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information here at Michigan State University. She has extensive experience conducting research and development work in Africa related to societal aspect of information and communications technology use and adaptation, and causes and consequences of climate change. She looked at these issues through a gendered lens. The research project have combined extensive field work with ecological and climate modeling funding by NSF, USAID, the Rockefeller Foundation, the United Nations Environment Programs, and others. And today, the title of their talk is Redesigning Agricultural Hand Tools in Western Kenya, Considering Human-Centered Design in Development Research. And Susan will talk first, and I understand she will leave a little bit earlier, and then Dr. Olson will pursue. Is that? Okay, so everybody, a warm welcome to our guests.
So thank you, Awa, and thank you all for coming to our talk this afternoon. I'm Susan Wyche, an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information. This is work done in collaboration with my colleague Jennifer Olson and Mary and Jerry Karanu, who works with our collaborating partner on this project, Rural Outreach Africa in Nairobi. Ginny and I are going to co-present this. I'm not 100% how it's going to work, but we've sort of practiced it, and we'll see how it goes. So there are a couple of things I want to achieve in this talk today. I want to discuss this idea of human-centered design, this approach to designing technology, including critiques of the approach. And the bulk of our talk will focus how we put this approach into action. The goal of our project was to understand how farmers used hand tools in rural Kenya and to explore their ideas for redesigning these tools, especially tools that could support weeding. We'll also talk about the evaluation of these new tools that are an outcome of this human-centered design project. We'll reflect on using human-centered design in development fieldwork, conclusions, and have time for questions. I anticipate us going for about 45 minutes today. So human-centered design, it's also known as design thinking, user-centered design, user experience. I mean, raise your hand if this is something you're familiar with. I know a couple people in the room are. Okay. I'll quickly go over a definition of it. Human-centered design is this discipline of generating new solutions to problems and opportunities through the process of making something where the process is driven by the needs, desires, and contexts of people being designed for. So it really emerged as sort of a counter to traditional approaches to design that typically put the technology first. And it's different from this by saying, let's put people at the center of the technology design process. Human-centered design is also a very creative process. It's highly subjective, incredibly interdisciplinary. It requires people with expertise on how to build technology, designers and computer scientists. It requires the expertise from people in the social sciences who study how people interact with technology. And it's also useful to have people who have knowledge in whatever topic it is that you're working on. In the case of our project, experts in agriculture in rural Kenya. There's a lot of focus on iteration, coming up with ideas, getting feedback, doing them over again. It's also a process that really embraces ambiguity, not really knowing what the outcome of it is going to be. And there's sort of an uneasiness with this process, particularly within disciplines that prioritize immediate action, rigorous evaluation, and who think that sort of research happens in a linear way. Human-centered design is ambiguous and a very open-ended process. So the approach generally involves these three phases, and I'm going to use these to structure the talk. The first is what's described as this understanding phase, understanding users' context, typically using qualitative methods, interviews, and observations to understand the people you're designing for. Using the findings from that phase to identify a problem, to define a problem, that they then use the findings from this understanding phase to sort of motivate or inspire design ideas. Doing brainstorming, drawing exercises, prototyping. When I say prototyping, do people know what that is? There's some jargon in my field that I'm not sure. Okay, making rough models of things. And then there's the evaluation phase. So you do all this work, you develop a promising solution, and then you evaluate it with the people you're working with. A little bit more background about human-centered design. It's a framework that has emerged from research conducted in ergonomics, computer science, and artificial intelligence. It's largely attributed to Donald Norman, who was a cognitive scientist at the University of California at San Diego. In my mind, it's an old idea. It emerged around the 1970s. It was a really central part to my undergraduate design training more than 20 years ago. And you'll see that there's some overlap with this approach to design and other sort of movements in international development. Notably the appropriate technology movement, using local materials to develop technologies for local use and then local people manufacturing them. Human-centered design also relies on participatory methods, and of course there's some parallels between this and the participatory development work. Human-centered design has been influential in a subfield of computer science known as human-computer interaction. That's the field I primarily work in. It's evolved and increasingly being adopted in other fields, public health, international development. And there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for this work. It's been popularized by the international design firm IDEO, Stanford's Design School or D School. They promote incorporating human-centered design to solve complex social problems related to health and international development. Funding agencies such as the Gates Foundation and USAID are increasingly interested in applying human-centered approaches to the work they do. Even here at Michigan State, there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm for human-centered design. It's really central to the way that, if you're familiar with the Hub for Innovation Learning over in Wells Hall, it's really central to how they approach problem solving there. We have programs and courses about it in my college, Communication Arts and Science. There's another program in Arts and Letters. I can think of at least 2 projects at the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation that have used human-centered design in Malawi. And then, John, you've also used it in some of your work in Tanzania, or were you doing the Malawi project as well?
Some in Tanzania and now in Uganda.
Okay. So although there's a lot of enthusiasm for this human-centered design approach, there are also a lot of critics of it, and rightfully so. Some scholars argue that there's very little evidence to suggest that human-centered design actually results in anything better than traditional design processes. There's a sense that using human-centered design in developing context is just another example of privileged researchers, typically from Western universities, traveling to poorer countries to solve problems enacted in design practice. There's also a sense that the social change promised by this approach rarely occurs, and it mostly just ends up benefiting Western design and technology companies rather than the communities involved in the human-centered design projects. Jenny and I are incredibly aware of these critiques and have been sensitive to them throughout our work. Our project represents a constructive and genuine collaboration between us and our collaborators at Rural Outreach Africa. Combined, Jenny and I have 40+ years of experience conducting participatory and design-oriented field work in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa. Rural Outreach Africa is an established NGO with decades of experience developing and implementing projects to support more than 50,000 Kenyan farmers. I think another thing that makes our project unique is that we're not the designers. I mean, Jenny and I are the ones making this stuff here. Instead, the designers for our project are these small-scale fabricators who work in rural Kenya known as jua kali, or with hot sun in Swahili. These are typically men who work in Kenya's informal sector as woodworkers, metal workers, mechanics, carpenters. So rather than using human-centered design to just benefit and advance our careers, our ultimate intention was to implement the approach so that the outcome could be manufactured, the tools could be manufactured and sold by these local jua kalis, and to ultimately benefit smallholder farmers. And finally, a number of these critiques are rarely grounded in practice. Something else that distinguishes our project from a number of others that have been published is that we go through the entire process, the understanding phase, the ideation stage, the prototyping phase, and evaluate these ideas. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So I'm going to talk about each phase of the project. And again, this is a case study that documents how we use this human-centered design approach to understand farmers' hand tools in rural Kenya, explore their ideas for new tools that are designed to make weeding easier. So I'm going to talk about what we did during each phase and what we found. I think I also want to emphasize that there was a lot of serendipity in this process. I think one of the challenges with presenting this work and writing about it is that there were just a lot of unanticipated things that happened over the course of our project that really benefited it. So I just want to call attention to that. So our fieldwork began in June of 2017. The findings presented here primarily come from 8 visits to Western Kenya between June of 2017 and the last one within January 2019. This was supported by one of the $50,000 grants from Michigan State's Alliance for African Partnership Program. And again, this is a program that encourages innovative and equitable partnerships between MSU and African institutions. We conducted our project primarily in Western Kenya, villages surrounding Kakamega and Vihiga counties. Agricultural has long been the dominant economic activity, especially for women in this part of Kenya. It's also where our partners' offices are located, and they have established networks with farmers in this part of Kenya. And we've been working with smallholder farmers. So food production, digging, planting seeds, and harvesting are all the arduous and time-consuming tasks. Prior efforts to really develop technologies that assist farmers primarily focus on mechanization, promoting, for example, tractors to assist farmers. But however, our observations and that most smallholder farmers aren't using these. They're still using these hand tools. So to date, we've worked with 26 registered groups of farmers in Western Kenya, and approximately 300 farmers have contributed to some phase of this project. So what we did, and again, this is this understanding phase. So Jenny and Mary began the project by visiting 5 groups of farmers in Western Kenya, and using group interview and observation methods to just understand the agricultural tools they had, what they were using, their experiences with them. During this phase, we also wanted to establish relationships with jua kali in the area. Again, these are the individuals who are going to help us make the prototypes of the tools and manufacture them. And what are the things that we found? Well, farmers brought a variety of tools to these sessions. A ponga, a machete used for harvesting maize. The slasher, something with a bent piece of metal at the end, typically used for cutting grass. We saw axes, shovels, rakes, ropes with knots tied in it, used for spacing out crops. But the most common and the most significant tool that we saw was the hand hoe, or in Swahili, the jembe. And there are multiple variations of this, some with forked blades, smaller blades, narrow blades. And these are ancient technologies. Other than replacing the wood with an iron blade, the design has remained relatively unchanged. And the jembe is generally considered the most significant piece of technology in rural household. It produces food and income, and farmers use it with an intimate and sophisticated knowledge of their soil and crops. And it's been written that these tools are so ubiquitous that they've largely been ignored by agricultural experts. And again, there's this assumption that farmers are replacing these tools with machinery, but that's just not the case. Farmers had a lot to say about these tools. Their comments included complaints about the handles, splinters from the wooden handles. A common concern was about the quality of the blades, especially ones that break, especially if you had rocks in your soil or it was particularly dry. They talked about the need to buy a new hoe a new metal blade every year. And again, this was an expense for many of the smallholder farmers in our group. But the most significant feedback of the djembe was about associated with weeding. Women in particular were especially vocal about this. So again, all aspects of food production are strenuous, breaking the soil and planting. But weeding was universally recognized as the most grueling task because it was reoccurrent. There's a sense that it never ended. You know, you pick one weed, another one grows. And you know, prior research tells us that women are responsible for 90% of weeding in East Africa. That was also the case within our sample. And women talked extensively about this process, you know, sharing their knowledge about when they knew it was time to weed, you know, typically about up to your ankles. Identifying particular weeds that were especially difficult to get. Couch grass with its sort of long roots and web-like roots was particularly difficult to pull. Other factors made weeding especially, well, literally backbreaking. This consistent bending and squatting really increased women's fatigue and led to lots of body aches, especially in their backs, hips, and shoulders. I like this picture. It's from a billboard in Nairobi, and although it sort of featured a man here, I think it sort of captures sort of the aches and pains that accompany weeding or agricultural work more generally. And there's just one more finding I want to draw attention to here in this understanding phase. When we talk to the farmers, we typically ask them to sort of reflect on the different technologies in their lives. So to talk about the CEMU or the mobile phone and the djembe. And this was a fairly typical response to this question. You use the djembe to dig, and then the land will produce food, and then I can sell part of the produce to buy a mobile phone. So there was sort of this sense that the djembe was more significant than the mobile phone, which, you know, personally in my field, you know, coming from the computer science discipline there's been a tremendous amount more work done on mobile phones in comparison to the djembe, so I think that's worth noting. So again, returning to these three phases, again, in the human-centered design process, the goal of the understanding phase is to identify an opportunity, to motivate design ideas. And then the next phase was to work with farmers to design new tools for weeding these ideas, especially using drawing. So I'm going to show you a short, like a 6-minute long video that walks you through this phase of the process.
In East Africa, most farmers live in areas that are actually pretty good for farming, but that also means that there are a lot of people crowded into that small area. So farms tend to be very, very small. The average is probably about 1 or 2 acres in size. So farmers are growing corn and beans on their small plots along with vegetables and selling their products mostly locally. So their incomes are small and their farms are small. New Tools for African Farmers project is based on the human-centered design approach. And what human-centered design is basically reversing the whole design process and asking the user, in this case the farmer, to design hand tools. The main collaborators are, at this point, Michigan State University, engineering students, engineering faculty, and with the College of Communication Arts and Sciences. Rural Outreach Africa program. They have a philosophy of working with farmer groups on very small scale and very low input technologies. And then our other collaborator is Endotech, an engineering company in Tanzania that is owned and was really started by an MSU alumni. We have the farmer-centered design process, and then we have engineers using very modern technology, working with farmers to see what's possible that way. The first thing we did in the project was ask people what tools they're currently using. By far the most common tool is the hand hoe. It's the most important tool that farmers use. 80 or 90% of the farmers use the hand hoe for preparing their soil. A big problem with the hand hoe is that their backs start hurting. It's difficult to use because you are bending when you're using it. There's a big gap in technologies available for the smaller farmers. There hasn't been very much attention paid to the tools that farmers are using, even though it's very obvious that they're very inefficient for labor. It is literally backbreaking work. What we did was we just started from scratch and we asked farmers to think of their actual ideal tool that they could possibly use and to design it, to sketch it. And then working with metal workers and having the metal workers make different prototypes. So our goal is to have the manufacturers, the local metal workers, be able to make these tools and sell them to farmers and make a profit, and then to help the farmers with these improved tools. There was initial hesitation when we gave them pieces of paper and told them to start drawing. It happened very quickly that they came up with ideas and started drawing and got more and more excited as they were designing new tools and then presenting their ideas to the group.
This one is here, the wheel that will be going, and as I go, like this, it have to be, I have to be at the middle of the line.
One exciting thing that came out of the design workshops was that 3 different small groups came up with a similar idea, which just so happened that that was a type of tool that already exists, has already existed in the US for years and years, and that is still being manufactured for small farmers. It's called the wheel hoe. 3 different groups came up with this. These designs that they're making will be made and they can try them out. So the excitement level has been incredible from the farmer's perspective. The project has taken off much faster than what we anticipated or what we planned. Still have to do the research to actually identify what is the impact of these new tools on labor efficiency, on health impacts of these tools, and also whether they're economical. We have to make sure that the new tools are actually ergonomic. So we need occupational therapists, human medicine, and public health people. We need to understand that before we can take this idea further and to other places. It's not that nobody has ever tried this before. This idea of turning it on its head and having the African farmers design the tools, I think is what's making the difference between something that doesn't fit their needs or it's too expensive or that can't be locally sourced or locally fixed compared to what we're doing, which is working both with the farmers and then the local manufacturers to make sure that those barriers are not preventing people from making new tools that would really make a difference. The potential for this project to totally transform how small-scale farmers do their work is enormous.
So you saw from the video, we had groups of farmers generate sketches about their ideas for new tools for weeding. You see that here. All of these are shown with the farmer's permission. And there are some similarities in these sketches. Many of them featured a redesign hand hoe that was described as two in one. You know, instead of carrying two hoes, it's better to combine them into one. You know, having a larger blade down here and then a smaller fork blade on the top. You see lots of annotations for new materials. So here you see it asking for a plastic handle. And although, and I should say it on this slide, you know, a number of these drawings featured redesigned hand hoes, you can see that there are lots of annotations sort of talking about the dimensions of the blade, the angles of the blade. So although they look sort of similar, there's sort of subtle variations in all these drawings and what the farmers wanted. So we took these findings, the farmers' sketches, and took them to the Juacali's workshops. And again, the next phase is once you've identified some promising ideas is to develop prototypes, and that's what you see here. So the Juacali developed 17 prototypes of 3 different tools. So this one we call the forked djembe, the wheel hoe, and then a stirrup weeder, which we don't have a picture of the stirrup weeder. And again, these reflected the Juacali's interpretation of the farmer's drawing, as well as their own knowledge of how to fabricate a strong and inexpensive tool with the materials they had available. So again, the last phase of this project is a human-centered design process is the evaluation, and I'm going to have Jenny talk about that.
Strange to use a microphone when it's not actually. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the evaluation phase and then turn it back to Susan, who will basically wrap it up. Yeah. So what we were interested in doing was getting feedback from the farmers, getting their ideas about the prototypes, and also from the Juacali themselves to figure out what the process meant for them. So what we did was we went to 19 different farmer groups from the ones who had designed it, and asked them a series of questions and filled out a questionnaire to get their impressions of the prototypes that they tried. So we had distributed the prototypes to these groups, and they had a couple weeks or so to try it out. And then we went back there and asked them a series of questions, and very deliberately asked mostly open-ended questions because we were very interested in getting not just what farmers were thinking about the tools, but also their evaluation criteria for the tools so that we could capture that as well. So this is a photo of that. And so it was very interesting that we were basically asking questions about 3 different tools, with 17 different prototypes of these tools, and an open-ended question, and it ended up that there was a very common set of criteria that farmers were using to evaluate the tools and provide comments. And they provided very, very detailed comments similar to their designs, and a lot of critical comments about the prototypes and things like that. But similarity, the most common thing that they first talked about, and the most common response had to do with how easy the tools were to use, and whether or not the tools made the work easier and faster. So the wheel hoe, for example, was the real example of a tool that made their work go very, very much faster than the traditional hand hoe for weeding. But the other tools did as well. And so the farmers actually calculated, and they, in their heads, and they gave the numbers of how much faster it would be to use the wheel hoe or one of the other tools to weed their field compared to the hand hoe. And of course that was important not just for their own work, but especially if they were hiring laborers and things like that. So they were already considering how they would incorporate the new tools into their process. And in addition to talking to these different farmer groups and getting their responses on questionnaires and things like that, we also went and talked to the Juacali to get their impressions of
especially the human-centered design process, because for them, it was basically, they were telling us the first time that they had actually started out with preferences of farmers, designed something and made something on the basis of that, rather than having these sort of standard things that they made, and they might tweak them a little bit depending on what the farmers were asking for. But it was a very different process for them. And when we found that out, what we did was we decided to have a meeting, a big meeting, bringing together the fabricators, the 5 Juacali that had made our prototypes, with a couple of the groups of farmers, and had first the farmers, give their feedback on the prototypes to the Juacali, and then the Juacali could respond to that. And it was really fascinating. For one thing, the Juacali were getting all this feedback from farmers about ways that prototypes needed to be altered, needed to be improved, and also other things that could be added in addition to what they had already done. So some new ideas for different tools or tweaking of the tools and things like that. A big response of the farmers, or concern of the farmers, response of the farmers had to do with price of the new tools. And so the Juacali, one of the things that they really tried to do was explain to the farmers why things were priced the way that they were priced. So, from the materials and how much the materials cost and how much the labor cost and all that kind of thing. It was the first time that the farmers in the Juacali had actually, sat down and discussed these things. And so we heard from both sides later on how interesting that was and how it actually made a difference. So what happened was the Juacalis then went back, and this wasn't part of the original project, but they went back and it started this iteration process back and forth of improving the prototypes, and then giving the farmers the improved prototypes, and then also making some of these ideas that the farmers had after our initial design workshop. So this is one of the ideas, which is it's like a rake, or a reading rake that they had to speed up things even faster than the original rake that we had on the wheel hoe. So the original wheel hoe design that we had just had 3 of these twines, and farmers really wanted something even bigger than that would go even faster. And there were a couple other designs that the farmers came up with that the Juacali created and tried out. So what's going on now, ever since all of this happened, is that some of these prototypes have turned out to be things that farmers are buying, not just the farmers that we were working with, but other farmers. So the Juacali are fabricating them and selling them. And also Rural Outreach Africa, the tools are now part of their suite of technologies that they're promoting in farmer field days and things like that. And we've had meetings with county government people and introduced them, and they're starting to promote these tools and things like that as well. So this is sort of taken off in Western Kenya, even without any funding from the AAP, even funding from the AAP, which is really unusual for projects that I've been involved with before. So yeah, very interesting. So sort of a summary of some lessons learned from this process. The designs themselves turned out to be innovative, I think, and different, and also very useful. So the process actually produced some designs that I think will have some lasting power. And then, if anybody has ever worked with farmers, you know that they can be very, very critical and can explain in great and gory detail, what they're feeling about a new variety, or in this case, tools. And so they provided a lot of details about how things could be improved and how things should be improved. But the incredible thing was the sense of ownership and buy-in that the farmers had because of this process. And I think that's one reason why it's had some lasting power. And another thing that we learned, and this is something that I think is a little bit different from a lot of other human-centered design and other projects that have happened, is that since we were using the local fabricators, and since they were part of the design process and this iteration process, I think not only does it have more lasting power, what they're doing, so the results of the project have more sustainability, but also they were saying that it's a new market for them. And this whole process of going to farmers and getting design ideas from this iterative thing was new to them. And they saw that as well as a very beneficial thing that they were going to be using in the future as well. And then this big question, the so what question of human-centered design is, by its own nature, it produces very, very specific solutions for a particular group that you're working with. And so the question is, can that solution be used anywhere else, since it's the process of, it's the product of that particular process. And what we're starting to realize is that some of the tools might be very, very useful for that particular location, but the process itself, and I think some of the tools as well have utility for elsewhere, and especially the lessons learned can be useful for elsewhere. Okay.
Thank you, Jenny.
Mm-hmm.
So coming back to the discussion, so we have this case study that's detailing our project. I think unlike prior studies, we really implement each phase of the project, the understanding, the ideation, the evaluation. It's clear that smallholder farmers have lots of ideas about how to redesign tools for themselves that benefit them. I think our approach also suggests some actionable strategies that probably won't be too surprising to this crowd, but the importance of closely collaborating with NGOs, and that there's usefulness in participatory approaches. I think significantly keeping the knowledge in the communities you're working with. I think that's something we did by working with the Wyche. I also think there's some broader implications of our work. So human-centered design is generally applied to developing these innovative digital technologies. But in our work, we used it to redesign this non-digital technology, the djembe. And what we found is that the things that farmers need may not need to be radically new and high-tech. Our project outcomes dramatically differ from the technologies being proposed for smallholder farmers, including things like mobile market information systems on mobile phones, even drones doing, I don't know what they're doing, but there are all these images with drones doing precision agriculture and things like that. But I think one thing that was really clear from our project is that what farmers want are just gradual improvements to the tools that they already have. And this suggests that the new and the digital might not always be better or even necessary. I think more broadly, by just narrowly focusing on digital technologies, technologists risk overlooking other significant technologies in people's lives, and more broadly, the long history of technological innovation that's existed on the African continent long before the mobile phone. We take seriously this role of ambiguity, this inability to know what the outcome of our approach will be. I mean, ultimately, the most compelling outcome might not be these new tools, but I think one thing we're pretty convinced about is that, getting farmers to talk to Wyche about, exactly what they want and the tools they use seemed pretty significant. Slightly redesigning them so that the angle was just right for their soil types, or that the width was accommodating to the way that they spaced their crops. Getting those conversations to happen did seem like a significant thing to emerge from this project. I think lastly, our project also draws attention to issues that are missing from these models of human-centered design. I think aspects of our project, in particular the drawing exercises, seemed successful. They raised challenging questions about intellectual property and who should get credit for designing these new tools. Is it the Wyche? Is it the farmer? Is it us? I mean, we don't have straightforward answers to this question. I think in our research, we really worked to clearly explain to farmers how their drawings and how their ideas would be used. All of them consented to us sharing them with the Wyche. We believe that the benefits of developing these new tools would outweigh the potential harm that could come from sharing their drawings with other people. But I think one thing that is really clear from our research is that these critiques of human-centered design are incomplete or insufficient if they don't also include these questions about intellectual property and ownership of the ideas. So to the conclusion of our talk, again, we use this human-centered design process to redesign hand tools. There are clearly some limitations of our work. It suffers from the same limitations that a number of these projects do. I mean, we still need to do more research to really understand the ultimate impact of these tools and to understand if manufacturing them really represents a viable livelihood strategy for the Juakali. We're working to secure more funding to do that. We're also continuing to work with local governments and polytechnics to explore ways to teach Juakali about this human-centered design process. So we've had a wonderful group of people work together on this project, including our collaborators at Rural Outreach Africa. Eric Goodman's helped us with this project, as well as Eric Torkelson. A special thanks to the Alliance for African Partnership for supporting this work. So that concludes my talk, and we would be more than happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions and comments.
Always on time.
Thank you guys, it was fascinating. So I have a question about, I guess, something you brought up was that farmers were concerned about the price of the tools coming from Juakali, and Juakali presumably were concerned about farmers not willing to pay enough for what they were producing, right? So I guess something that I'm wondering is whether you have any updates, even if anecdotal, about, say, the longevity of the ability to use those tools, or the cost or ease of upkeep for the tools, because obviously a wheeled hoe is more complicated than a straight wooden handle hoe. So I guess that's where my first question would go. I have like 50 million, but that's the only one.
I'll let you answer this one, Jenny.
Okay.
Having also worked in Western Kenya as an agriculture volunteer scorer, one of the impacts I would guess you're going to see could be environmental, because this kind of labor-intensive agriculture on small plots can be more environmentally sustainable than some, large-scale mechanized agriculture, for one thing. But also, I always heard labor-saving technologies that were promoted in agriculture, especially with things like rice, to be chemical. Mm-hmm. And so the farmers were always like, wow, if only, we had Roundup, we'd be great, we wouldn't have to work so hard. And now that we know, I think it's more common that people understand the environmental impacts of those chemicals, but then you're bringing in another way to address labor without taking that route. So just if you haven't been promoting the environmental outcomes, could be a thing to do.
Yeah, you're right. Why don't I respond to these first two questions first? Yeah, your question about price is right on. Of course, that's, key for both the farmers and the Juakali. And I don't remember exactly what you said because I got started thinking about her question, but what's ended up happening, as the Juakali have started to try and sell these tools, and Rural Outreach is promoting them and things like that, is, we started out with maybe around 7 or 8 possible tools, and we ended up doing 3, and of those we ended up with, 17 prototypes, and then the best of those prototypes, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the tool that's being sold the most is the cheapest of those, which is the small hoe, with the both the blade and the rake on the other end. Partly because it's cheap and it's very familiar, and it's very easy to use. And what's turning out for the other tools is that the wheel hoe is probably too expensive for the really small farmers and the older ladies and things like that. But it makes a lot of sense for farmers who are paying laborers, because it does save them a lot of money, and they've calculated it. And so probably what will happen, and this is starting to happen, is that the wheel hoe itself will probably be more successful in places with smaller, a little bit larger farms, but sort of in between the tractors and the hand hoe scale, especially for whatever reason, potato farmers. This is a big deal for potato farmers. So, we were sort of expecting that, but it's actually started to happen in practice at the scale, the price of the tool, and, that has also sort of gone along with, the scale of the farm that it makes most sense for. Yeah. And so the 3 tools that we ended up with, all 3 turn out to be economically viable, but just not for the same size farm at all. Yeah, and your question about herbicide is really on the case. So, in Kenya, there's starting to be a lot more interest in the impacts of chemicals on food, because people are seeing it. And also farmers are seeing the impact of the chemicals on their own bodies. And so Roundup is from an economical perspective, Roundup is probably cheaper than hiring, a bunch of people with hand hoes if you have a medium or large scale farm. And so that's exactly what's happening, is that for maize and crops that Roundup works on, that's being more and more used. And so farmers actually volunteered that fact that, using the weeding tools that they've developed, that was developed with this project, mean that they don't have to use as much Roundup. And they also really like it because they don't have to monocrop, that they can put in the beans and the maize and things like that, and which you can't when you're doing Roundup. You can only have monocrop maize. But yeah, you're right. I should promote that a lot more. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's my turn. Hi, good to see you. Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And just curiosity, I was thinking when you were talking about the design groups, like how was the negotiation between the different participants in terms of who make the decision, who have better ideas? It was a mix of male and female, because there is like difference, right, between women negotiating and men. So it's just curiosity, just if you can.
We had men's groups and women's groups, and that seemed to be successful.
But in terms of the specific negotiation among the groups, I can't recall that or speak to that, but it did seem like a useful strategy to have men and women working in different groups.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting. So there was dynamics that went on, like within the small groups, and we asked the people, we started out with a large group in each case of, say 50 people, and then asked them to divide themselves up into smaller groups. And so they almost always, and men and women separately, and it almost always ended up that the younger women got together and the older women got together, and, friends got together and people that they knew each other. And so we didn't look at that specifically at how they were deciding what to draw. Often people started out being a bit embarrassed about drawing, saying, I haven't had to draw since I was in first grade. But then getting over that and drawing. And so I don't know. There were a couple very strong personalities, of course, whose ideas ended up coming to the fore. I'm thinking of one woman in particular. But yeah, that happened for sure. And then each group had to present their ideas to the whole group. And that was not a quiet process. There was always a lot of, going back and forth and things like that. And, disbelief and, and support and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, does that get it?
Who chose the project, like the designs that were going to move forward for the manufacture?
Okay, so that we decided that. Okay. And how we decided is we looked at all the ideas that had come forth to see if there were some commonalities. And then we also worked with some engineers and the Juakali themselves to see what made most sense in terms of, what you could make and what would actually work and that kind of thing. And that's how we ended up with some of the different types of things that we asked the Duocolli to make the prototypes of, these 17 different prototypes. So it narrowed down from a lot to a few. And then from those prototypes, when we did the evaluation, it turned out that there was some of the prototypes that were much better than the other prototypes. So that narrowed it down even further. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So how did you frame this as you presented the design sprint, I'm going to call it, to the farmers? Like, what information did you give them? How much time did you let them explore the problem?
First we went through this sort of a needs assessment, or what's it called? The understanding phase. And then from that, and we asked them directly, after what we did was we asked them to bring their current tools. And so they didn't bring just their current tools, they brought literally their great-grandmother's handheld. It was amazing. It was just incredible. And each tool had a story. It was just amazing. But then we asked them, what are the good and the bad things about these different tools? And there started to be a consensus over, what the tools were that they used mostly, and then what the problems that they had with those tools. And frankly, the reason why we ended up with weeding as the task to focus on was because, the big tasks are preparing the soil, which is just really heavy, heavy work, weeding and harvesting. And, after talking to the engineers, and both in Kenya and here, it became clear that plowing the soil and things like that was something more than what we were able to do in a small project. And harvesting, it just depends on the crop and all that kind of thing, but weeding seemed like it's something that we could tackle. And that, as Susan mentioned, because of the pain, the back pain and things like that, it was something that especially the women were really complaining about. So what we did was, in the design workshops, was we gave the task. The task was to come up with their ideal weeding tool. So that was the only instructions that they were given. And then they were given, paper and pens and things like that. And they had, half an hour or something like that? Or
It seemed like, it depended on the size, and we had about a half-hour drawing, then the presentation.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. And most groups had more than one idea. Most groups had, 2 or 3 or 4 ideas. Yeah.
Susan and Jenny love the project, always have, and so neat to see where it's emerged into. So I have 2 questions. One is about evaluation, one is about the critiques of HCD. So around evaluation, you a number of times mentioned the process itself is highly ambiguous. So to allow this space. So, and I've also heard you were learning and assessing products that came out, but also the process. And learning from both of those. So eager to hear your thoughts around sort of evaluation approaches that capture both learning on those dimensions that also allows for the ambiguity. Your key results framework isn't established hardcore right from the beginning. So how do you, what sort of evaluation approaches have you found useful? And then the second one is around the critiques. You mentioned some really thoughtful critiques at the earlier intro to this of HCD as a process, and eager to hear your thoughts about how your project is affirming some of those or addressing those. And you mentioned a little bit of some of the gaps you see in some of the models. Eager to hear any more comments on that. So thanks so much.
So thank you, John. Why don't you answer about the evaluation, and I'll answer about the critiques.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So for the evaluation, we were basically starting from tabula rasa, from figuring out from the beginning what we thought would be best, and after looking at what a lot of other projects had done and studies had done. And so we did a couple different things. One was a questionnaire with both open-ended and closed-ended. And so the questionnaire was done at the group level, and it was sort of a consensus of what the group felt about the different prototypes. And so during that meeting, of course, they were meeting both the what was ended up with in the consensus was recorded on the questionnaire, but also the process was very interesting as well to see how they came up with their consensus of, their evaluation of the prototype. And so that was captured with video. We took videos of it. But then another part of it was, and we learned very different information from this, was actually observing them trying out the different tools, both at the very beginning when it was their first time to try it out, as well as later on when they had more time and and they were using it. And so we were watching them and taking videos of them and asking them questions. So more of a observational kind of thing, and that gave very different information of. That part gave information about the tool itself and the difficulties in using the tool itself that we wouldn't have gotten from just the questionnaire. Because we saw that, for example, that one tool was a favorite of the old ladies, and another tool was a favorite of the men, so we learned very different things from the observations, yeah. Okay.
So in terms of the critiques, I think a lot of the most interesting work about human-centered design is being critical of the approach. Our work, it's a very buzzword. I really tried to emphasize the enthusiasm for it. We're sort of riding that wave, it's a way to get funding. We have another project that's using this human-centered design approach. I'm critical of it. I really, like I said, I think a lot of the most interesting work is being critical of the process. But I think a limitation of this work is that it doesn't, what is the alternative? I do think this idea of looking at technology and understanding people's perspective and incorporating that into the design process is valuable. And I think one thing we're learning from this project and another project is that, and I mentioned this in the talk, just getting people together and talking. I see that as one of the most significant outcomes of the work. Having farmers talking to Juakali, and this other NIH project we're working on, having computer scientists talk to public health practitioners, getting all of those people in the same room to talk about the work they're doing. I think that's one of the most beneficial outcomes. But I think it's really hard to find any compelling examples of anything that's emerged from this really sort of had the type of impact that I think that that this approach sort of promises or hopes for. And I think it's important to be aware of that when you're implementing this approach.
Maybe you have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, that's. On our projects, we're looking at using human-centered design in academic spaces. Thinking about what's the valuable way, what would not necessarily new questions, but the djembe is to farming perhaps as teaching is to universities. It's a tool that's used to accomplish purposes. So we're sharing some of the very similar observations you're coming away with, but really feel the value of this is really trying to bring together across sectors and across users, what does it mean to look like to put these people together across the spectrum of whatever the process might be, whether it's teaching or whether it's the traditional roles of outreach and engagement of universities. And Michigan State has a long history of this in very positive ways of trying to think through instead of outreach to, what does outreach with look like? And so, eager to continue the conversations.
Brian, did you have another question? You're okay? Okay.
No, because I'll go on for like an hour.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne.
Thank you all.
We appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for coming. See you next. For next Thursday, Jamie is presenting her documentary, and it's going to be on 303. Hope to see you. Bye.
Thank you.